Welcome to the Radiant Astrology Podcast, where we illuminate the wisdom of the cosmos for spiritual insight and soul-level healing. I'm your host, Christina Caudill. Thank you for joining me. Hello, this is Christina Caudill with Radiant Astrology, and thank you for joining me today. We're going to be talking about how to prepare for outer planet transits. That's Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And these are transits to the natal chart. I had a client recently who she was having all three outer planets transiting her personal planets as well as some angles. And that's a lot of energy to be processing. And she asked me, how do I invite them in? Which I think was, first of all, the perfect way to align to what's happening is you really have to invite them in, because the outer planets, they're bigger than us. They are so much associated with the gods for a reason. And they're very powerful. And when they activate your natal planets or points like angles, then it can potentially be life-changing. And so we'll discuss that today. First of all, I do want to remind you to please go and sign up for my newsletter. It's at radiantastrology.com/sign up. And there you will get all of my updates, my offerings, my writings, my podcast notifications. So it's a great way to stay up to date with what I have going on. Also, I'd appreciate a 5-star review on the Apple Podcast app. I've mentioned before that I switched podcast providers in January, and I lost all my reviews. I had years worth of reviews. And really, I need to grow those in order to grow the podcast. So leaving me a review will be very helpful for that. And I thank you in advance for that. Also, I am still offering readings over the summer. I'm generally trying to take things a little bit lighter because I want to enjoy, what's left of the summer. So you can visit my website, radiantastrology.com. I have some readings available. I also have some courses and webinars in my shop, so you can take a look at that as well. All right. So let's look at the outer planets. First of all, it's really important to realize that when you have one of these transits, it's not just sort of like a one and done kind of quick thing that, a lot of times happens when we have faster moving planets transiting our chart. So it's typically a 2 to 3 year experience with Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto transits. And it can feel like, it's not usually ongoing for 3 years. You're constantly going to get, say Pluto like on top of you for that whole time. But the closer it is to the planet or point in your chart, within say a 3 degree, even 3 degree, I would say, because Pluto moves so slowly, you really want it to like exact to the degree. But you'll feel it coming, obviously. I mean, the 3 degree orb is there for a reason. It tends to show up, the energy of whatever planet it is. But because Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are so slow moving, the closer they are to aspecting a planet in your chart, then the more you're going to directly feel it. Now, these planets move really slowly, so they kind of create, the landscape of our life. I've said many times that the outer planets, like they're changing signs. They are all in the process of, moving between signs right now. And they are changing the landscape of our collective experience. I've read other astrologers say, oh, the outer planets are collective. they're not personal. Well, when they are aspecting your chart, it becomes personal, right? So you can't say that they are only outer planets. And even the outer planets in our natal chart, especially if they are aspecting a planet or point or whatever house they're in, it's personal too. It's the collective and the personal. And we do see that. I feel like these outer planets have a lot to do with the collective unconscious. And we are all already connected to the collective unconscious through the archetypes, right? Like, for instance, the archetype of the mother, we all have a sense of what that means, even if personally it has expressed, uniquely to us. And, this year that we're in, 2024, is definitely a transition year because of these outer planets, sort of preparing to change signs. Pluto's been going back and forth between Aquarius and Capricorn, and then will finally be in Aquarius for the long term in 2025. But I'll talk about that in plenty of other podcasts, and I already have, and I will continue to do so. But when it's affecting us personally, these can be really life-changing experiences. And I'll talk about the nature of each of these planets and how to invite them in, just sort of in a general sense. I'm not going to go through, how they aspect each, planet in your natal chart. Maybe I'll do that for a future episode if that's what you want. And if so, leave me a comment on social media. But first of all, just in a general sense, these are longer term transits. And that's important to pay attention to because, the speed of the planets, that's another podcast I want to do dedicated on, but is the speed of a planet is so important because it tells you and it shows you how long you're going to be dealing with a certain transit. We've got the moon that, makes its way throughout the entire natal chart in a month. And then you have Pluto that takes 248 years to go around the zodiac, right? So nobody's going to have a Pluto return. We have the United States going through a Pluto return. But that is, sort of a longer living entity than any of us individually. And so what typically happens is one of the outer planets will pass over an aspect to a planet or point in your chart. And I'm looking at, either conjunction, square, opposition, that kind of thing, even trine, of course. But what will happen is it will contact that planet the first pass. And then it will retrograde, right? And these planets can be retrograde for months that they do every year. And then the planet will come back again and give you a second experience, a second hit, for instance. And then it will retrograde over it again. And then a third time, usually. And then it will go back. And when it retrogrades, it might not go back all the way for an exact conjunction. It's generally about 3 times. I mean, again, if you're using wider orbs, you can stretch that even more. If it's like coming close to that planet, but not quite making it. And that I would look at if one is like on its way coming, pay attention to the signs of what this planet might have in store for you. And I've always seen it that the first pass is generally the hardest because we don't have those inner resources needed that actually that planet wants for you to develop, right? Like there's a reason that you're having these experiences with these outer planets is you're meant to change from them. They're transformational planets. I mean, the worst thing that can happen is that you just wait for it to, work its magic or work its destruction or whatever on yourself or in your life. And then you go back to not being changed from it. And that can happen to anybody, especially if you're not paying attention to astrology. If you think you just had like a couple of years of bad luck. When we are actually conscious of these planets. They have a nature, they have a purpose, and how am I going to invite it in? How am I going to allow it to change me? And also, what do I stay true to also during this time? And a lot of times the things that you stay true to, you can really deepen into that commitment with those particular values. So by the second or third pass of these transits, hopefully you have actually done some deep inner work, some reflection, some questioning, some, having to build up the necessary skills or the strength, or surrendering, which is actually what a lot of these planets also ask for us to do. Whatever is necessary at that time, that you are transformed in a significant way. And so considering that there's a transformation that is, unfolding for you, that you're invited to. And so, as I said, when my client said, how do I invite these planets in? I mean, I thought that was the perfect way to orient to these transits, because they are unstoppable. And it's actually kind of, some of them are just the most magical experiences, even if they can be very challenging at first, and it's hard to say. You can't ever really say if an outer planet transit is going to be like a dream come true, or just absolutely like, everything you've wished for, or things you haven't even wished for that are coming to you, or if they can be absolutely devastating and, destructive to what your known life, that is also a potential, because these planets don't happen in a vacuum, right? And your natal chart doesn't happen in a vacuum too. Because if an outer planet transit is happening, let's say, to your sun, and if your sun squares your Venus, then Venus is pulled in, so it can get more complex in that way. But this is why I want to kind of just bring it into the essence of what these planets are about. So a couple of years ago, I did a course on midlife transits, where I specifically looked at Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto transits. That's available on my website at radiantastrology.com. But these don't have to happen in midlife. What happens in midlife is we all have the Pluto square, the Neptune square, the Uranus opposition, and they tend to come like boom, 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 one after another. So they can, that is what I was focused on at that time. But, we can all at any time in life have any of these planets affecting us. And so essentially, you just want to be aware of what's happening. I think, one of the things that can be, that people need to realize is, like, if I'll have someone say, oh, Pluto's going to be on my moon on Tuesday or something like that. It's like, okay, well, do you know that Pluto only moves a couple of degrees a year? These are ongoing things, and there's generally no easy solution to it. There's no easy escape from them. But again, they're meant to show us something about ourselves, about our lives, about our destiny. So let's start with Uranus. So Uranus is symbolic of Prometheus, right? The god of fire, the god who stole, fire from the gods who gave it to humanity, for that sort of that light of awakening, and was punished for it. But when we think of Uranus's nature, the first thing that comes to mind for me is shattering. Is the energy of shattering, that which you've, whether it's that you have been expecting to sort of support your life, or just that which you've known to be true. It shatters our expectations and our paradigms and our relationships even. And especially if it's, say, in a conjunction to one of our planets, that could be a shattering that's coming from within, a needing to liberate internally, a needing to change, or even to get more excitement, right? To awaken, just like, the Prometheus's fire. And in that sense, it can be really exciting. Oftentimes when we think of like the midlife crisis, it's like suddenly nothing fits. Suddenly everything feels stale or restricting, and Uranus comes and, wants to break free from restrictions and limitations. And it's flipping the script. I've often seen people who forever, maybe they always thought they wanted to be single and they were fine being single. And Uranus comes and suddenly they want to get married and have kids and have a traditional relationship or something like that. Right. And it can be the opposite. We often think of it the opposite as someone who's, they work so hard to have a life that's like stable and that like fits in sort of the social structures that they live in. And then they just want to shatter that, they don't want that anymore. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that dramatic on the outside. It can be, I remember one woman that was having, I think it was Uranus. I know it was a Uranus transit, but I can't remember how many planets. I believe it was like pinging many planets in her chart. And she was like, oh my God, I have my mother-in-law living with me. That's very much, extended family can very much be Uranian, right? Because they're not really your family, but they are, and they're there. She had her mother-in-law living with her, and then, I don't know, something broke, and then there was a fire, and then there was a neighbor who, got ill or died, it was just so much chaos, and it was so Uranian. And Uranus can force us to just kind of be on our toes and have to accelerate things. Maybe we don't even have time to think about it. You just have to respond to so many things changing around you. And if it's an opposition of Uranus, then that can tend to be external forces or relationship, right? Oppositions mean external forces. Or they can symbolize relationships. And then if it's a square, that tends to be sort of a challenge, some kind of conflict. But Uranus really can be surprising as much as it can be shocking. But whatever it is that Uranus is shattering, like go with, try to go on top of it, right? Know that there is something opening up for you, and I say this again, this can show up in many ways that can be exciting and fun and glorious, and other ways that can be, devastating. So I don't want to make light of it entirely, but I also don't want to say that, it's always going to be bad or scary or what have you. Just for the general nature is that whatever is shattering needs to shatter. It's time for it to change and to shatter. And how to invite it in is to go with a sense of newness, a sense of a refreshing change, or like a sudden rebirth. It's kind of like the baby bird being thrown out of the nest, and you have to like fly or not, or sink or swim. There is a sense of either being thrown out of the nest or jumping out of the nest. I've often heard astrologers say, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing, which generally can be true. It's kind of like, oh, suddenly I want a change. So I just quit my job and I have nothing to go to. And I just want to, just trip my way around the world or something. But that I can see how that is like, okay, just make sure that you're not completely, leaving yourself in a situation where you could have like a great fall. However, I do feel that sometimes that, yes, sometimes people really do need to shift things in a big way and change things and not be so concerned about, keeping everything in the structure that they've known. One of the great things with Uranus is the sense of not caring about other people's judgments. and that's the time to really be, they say that Uranus is objective, but it can also be like, let people judge me. It's more important for me to be true to myself and to me to be truly authentic. And maybe you're just discovering what it is to be truly authentic. It's also can be very valuable to look back at your Saturn return at age 29 around that time, or any, like maybe even a recent Saturn, a very strong Saturn transit to one of your planets that kind of shows you when you do your Saturn work. A lot of times that means having to be responsible, having to, fit into a role in society and those kinds of things. But then Uranus comes and suddenly that's not so important anymore. Suddenly it's more important for the life force to come through. So from the Uranus, say we're talking about the Uranus opposition, which tends to comes into like the early to mid 40s. Oftentimes, if we can look back at what were the lessons during the Saturn return that said, I have to grow up, I have to adult for the first time, I have to define myself by society standards. Well, when the Uranus opposition tends to come, there's usually, it's like, okay, I've done that. I've done the society thing. Now it's time for the unlived life to start living through me, because I cannot live solely by society's judgments and society's restrictions and standards. And, I always love to think about when Snoop, the rapper Snoop Dogg earned his Hollywood star. And there's a video where he talks about who he wants to thank. And he says, I want to thank me. I want to thank me for believing in me. I want to thank me for never letting me down. I want to thank me for always, doing the right thing. And he was having Uranus exactly on his ascendant in Taurus at the time. And there is something about valuing yourself again, and realizing that sometimes it might feel like you against the world, but that when you're really, believing in yourself and you're really accessing your creativity or your, letting your life force, all that which excites you and sort of enlivens you, when you let that through and sort of channel that energy, that you can feel superhuman. That's another thing with Uranus, is feeling beyond the limits, of what we think of being human, which is very Saturnian. All right. And so with Neptune, let's move on to the planet of illusion, imagination, fantasy, dreams. Now, the nature of Neptune by transit, oftentimes, again, these can show up in many different ways, but one of the first things I think of is dissolving. What is dissolving? Just kind of like a sugar cube, when you drop water on it. It's disillusion. And it can be oftentimes very disillusioning, like when we wake from a dream that we've been in, or waking from an addiction, or seeing clearly, like when the fog lifts. These are a lot of sort of metaphors for Neptune transit. And oftentimes it's something washing away, like a dream washing away. And then suddenly we have this space before a new dream or a new inspiration can fill it. But that in between space can often be very difficult. When we feel like maybe we've lost one source of inspiration, or source of dream that we always had sort of clung to. And it either dissolves or we're disillusioned. I see oftentimes people, so many people have had experiences with, maybe they didn't realize they were like in a cult, for instance. And then later they realize, oh my God, this is a cult, this is draining me, draining my life force. And you need to separate from it. But then, what fills that space? It's almost like having a blood transfusion. But in that in-between time, going from disillusioning or dissolving to awakening, that's when a lot of people have a difficult time. They can have an existential crisis. And I can't tell you how many times I've had clients who've said, I finally reached a point where, I don't have to make money. I have all the money I need. I don't have to have a job or anything. But now I don't know what to do with myself. And I'm telling you, these can be some of the most difficult experiences when we could do anything, but we just don't have that internal fire, of passion or interest or inspiration to carry us through, to get us out of bed or do anything. And I know it's, we think, oh, wow, like poor me. But on a soul level, and also on just a mental and emotional level, it can be like being a ghost in your own life. And that really is, and I think we've also, everyone has maybe experienced it on some level. Maybe it isn't tied specifically to money or to having anything. A lot of times it can be dealing with grief. And sometimes grief, we've cried ourselves, dry, and yet there's still something there that is sort of sitting with us, that isn't easy to process, or it's not easy to move forward from it. And there are times when, with Neptune, we do have to be in this sort of transitional space that can be really uncomfortable. And so how to invite Neptune in is really to surrender to the moment, to know that this is part of the process, whether it is being in confusion or being in grief or being in, not knowing where the next answer is coming from. And when I was, a young astrologer and I would have people in Neptune transits, they almost always would be like, well, tell me what I'm supposed to do. Tell me where my inspiration is. That's not something I, as an astrologer, can see. You can maybe get some inclinations of where this person might find satisfaction, with their moon or Venus or what have you, or even their sun, but they have to answer it for themselves. And I remember this had happened to me a few times in the beginning where I would say, well, what about this? Or what about this? And what about that? This looks like something that would, be of interest with someone with your planetary signatures. And they would always say things like, oh, I already tried that. Or no, that doesn't inspire me, or whatever, like I, as an astrologer, cannot solve someone's existential crisis. They have to be in that space. And sometimes just being with a person during that time, witnessing them, listening to them, and turning on the questions to them, and oftentimes even saying, well, what would be inspirational to you? Or when was the last time you experienced something that uplifted you or tugged at your heartstrings or something like that? The answer has to come from within them, but there can be a time where they are so numbed, because Neptune can be like a anesthesia in a way. You can be so numb to life. And sometimes even just okay, well, I'm so numb, let me do more indulging of food or drink or drugs or love or, whatever. But there is no satisfaction there. And really what Neptune wants is the surrender to the moment, to adjusting to, the wind sails in your boat, as you're floating in the spiritual ocean. And you wander and find your curiosity again. And so in this empty space, where your mind and heart goes, that can tend to show you what you're gravitating toward. Yeah, and this can even be illness as well at times, right? With Neptune, if there's like a disease, or if there is something that is taking you out of everyday life, the Saturnian, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, that kind of thing. With Neptune, sometimes we're taken out of that time bound life, and we can be in a time warp. And there's times where it can even feel like, not knowing whether you're dreaming or you're awake, right? Because it's very much associated with the dream world. So some things that can help to invite Neptune is music. That energy of music can help to attune to what your soul is feeling, and then that can open up to potentials for inspiration, or for finding some sense of where your satisfaction lies. And anything artistic, poetry, visual art, whatever one is drawn to, that can be incredibly healing during a Neptune transit. Of course, spirituality, if the person is spiritual, finding an opening for that. And little things, even like working with crystals, that you're drawn to, putting like a rose quartz on your heart, or like feeling those subtleties, the very, very subtle energies of crystals. Working on a more subtle energy body level is really what can be very helpful during Neptune transits. And I feel like dream work is also so important. And dream work, I have found through going through this Jungian Life's Dream School, is actually a lot more complicated than we think of it, because there's so many associations that these dreams could possibly be trying to awaken us to. I personally really love the dream circle that I'm part of. That's every couple of weeks. And, one person shares their dream, and the rest of us kind of share our own associations with it. And like, if it were my dream, what would it be trying to tell me? And these kinds of things, I think, can be incredibly, incredibly healing and awakening too, because, I always learn so much when I share my dream with a real trusted circle of people who are there to help, like, illuminate, some insight from that dream. All right. And so let's move on to Pluto. Now, Pluto and Pluto transits, they tend to be the loudest thing happening, if you're having one. And, I often do readings like every couple of months. I offer a specific reading because I found people, really value that and enjoy that. Like, for instance, I just did like a Jupiter and Gemini readings, lunar node readings, things like that, that are really focused. However, if there is something major else happening in the chart, I can't ignore it, because nothing happens in a vacuum. So if someone is also having a Pluto transit, I always have to at least make some kind of acknowledgement of that, because the nature of Pluto is metamorphosis. And it's typically about eliminating something, stripping it down to the bone, that feeling of, seeing what is toxic, exposing what is toxic in the life, or what is in decay. It's no longer nourishing. It's no longer giving life force. Even to the point where it could feel like scorched earth, right? And it's interesting because during, certain times in human history, like for instance, during the Holocaust, where was Pluto? Pluto was in Cancer, opposite where it is now. And it really was, when you think about that archetype, it was that sort of toxic and decay of Pluto in, what should have been nurturing and nourishing is the Cancer archetype. And so that's kind of just an extreme example in terms of collectively. Pluto is always around and doing something to someone and doing something to all of us, depending on the sign it's in, we can see the nature of it collectively. But when we're experiencing it personally, that is probably the ultimate experience of an opportunity to truly be changed, to change and be changed. And Jeffrey Wolf Green specifically wanted to delineate the difference between a transformation, say, of any of the other outer planets versus the Pluto metamorphosis, which is something completely, essentially dying, and then a transformation happening in order to be reborn again, like the caterpillar, it going into a chrysalis and it completely dissolves before it becomes a butterfly, right? And I've said this before, it doesn't just, sprout butterfly wings. It actually is dissolved. I think it's spine and everything, all the organs, everything, like, so strange, dissolves in order to be changed. So then it can then fly. And it may sound dramatic, but there kind of isn't any way to underplay a Pluto transit. It can be dramatic in different ways. Again, what kind of aspect is happening? Is it a conjunction, which is generally like this internal transformation? Is it an opposition where we're going up against some big force that may be against us, it feels like, and even squares can also be that too, like having to change because of some, external trigger, external force. But it doesn't always have to be bad. I mean, I've seen people, oftentimes when you go through a complete different change in life, and it could be, getting a new job or getting a promotion that you've never been, in this space before. Something has to transform internally for you to be that. Like when you finally decide, okay, I'm going to be an astrologer. Like when I became an astrologer and I really became one, I was having a Pluto square, exactly square my ascendant, exactly square Pluto, because I natally have a Pluto exact square to my ascendant. And it was having to be a completely different human, show up in a completely different way. And oftentimes at first it can feel like a sense of disempowerment, right? Like, because you go from disempowerment to feeling it to the bottom, feeling the rock bottom experience oftentimes, where there's no way out, there's no turning back. Oftentimes with Pluto transits, there's something that has been going on a long, long time, and it's had an opportunity to fester and become toxic or in decay, to no longer be nourishing. And then it's something that we can no longer ignore. It's something that's happening now, that we have to face. Especially, and I would look at Pluto, especially in terms of when it's retrograde, a lot of that Pluto energy is like still is hidden from view. When it goes direct, that's when, and especially the stationary periods, when Pluto's stationing, that's why I often make a big deal of it, is because it's really emphasizing that Pluto energy at that time. When it stations direct, sometimes it can just be this exposure of that which has been hidden or in decay, or in, and we may have these experiences of, the worst of Pluto can be that sense of abandonment or betrayal, those kinds of energies. But really, by transit, ultimately, once we've come out of a Pluto transit, hopefully we're changed in a significant and meaningful way, and we can be empowered because of it. So how to invite it in, is understanding that there is something that is toxic that needs to be eliminated, that needs to be stripped down to its essence, right? To the essence of what is really important. And maybe a sense of, you yourself. I remember having a Pluto transit where I just felt so um, disappointed, like in humanity, that there are people who will behave in certain ways, and all for a sense of power. And it had me looking at, what is my addiction to what I feel is like forms of power. And that's something that is so important to look at. Like when we think, oh, we are at the mercy of, say, other people. Well, why are we at their mercy? Is it because there's a job that I feel I've identified with? And that's the thing with Pluto, that can change your sense of identity. Is it the money I'm addicted to? Is it the relationship I'm addicted to? Is it, the prestige, the title? And in relationships, is it another person who represents someone to me, who I would feel unloved if they didn't love me back? What are these outer sources of power that we are giving ourselves away to? And I often see that with Pluto, the turning into yourself to see that you have an inner source, an inner resource, of your own personal empowerment. And that's oftentimes what is being called of at that time, and I've seen so many people, especially go through the Pluto square, which is usually between age 37 and 40 or something. And that is oftentimes a sense of, other people, maybe even when you become the bad guy and everyone's pointing their finger at you saying you did something horrible, you did something destructive. And when the only thing you have left is knowing who you are. And Pluto experiences are everything, it's birth and death. And in those times, we are only alone with our soul. And Pluto transits can be those other times. They're initiatory experiences. They're shamanic in nature, where you're facing the dark. You may even be facing your own darkness, whether you're facing the darkness of others or your own darkness. There is the sense of, where do I go that is actual light, and that is, aligning me to my own source of what is most important to me and for me. And so, keeping sort of the hope alive during a Pluto transit, that whatever is necessary to be eliminated, is likely it's draining you of your power. And that when you come through this, you can be renewed. And then you can find a new way of being that isn't relying on sources of power that are destructive and that are no longer serving you. And I think that anytime we have a Pluto transit, really sitting with that, and talking to even like an astrologer who really understands it, and sitting with that particular thing. Again, none of these transits happen in a vacuum, and our natal chart doesn't happen in a vacuum, but really sitting with, one of these major planets at a time can really help you to go deep with it and understand it. And you might as well, because it's going to be going on for a few years, and it's going to be changing the nature of your relationship to reality, to your life. All right. Well, I think I've gone on enough today for that little overview. So if you would like more in-depth insight to your own natal chart or to some transits that you're having, you can book a reading with me on my website at radiantastrology.com. And if you know anyone who this can be useful to, please send them my way or share this podcast with them. It really helps me to keep doing this work that I love and that I know is meaningful to myself and to the rest of humanity. And be sure to sign up to my newsletter list at radiantastrology.com/sign-up. There you can get all of the updates on my goings on, my offers, my limited time offers and courses. I'd also, as I said, appreciate a 5-star review on the Apple Podcast app. That will definitely help to grow the podcast. And that is it for now. I hope you enjoyed this podcast, and I look forward to connecting with you again in the future. Take care. Bye-bye.